Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about environmental economics. So first we want to talk a little bit about private costs and sort of distinguish them from social costs. A private cost is a cost borne solely by the individuals who incur them. It's also like an internal cost. While a social cost is the full costs borne by society whenever a resource use occurs. It's measured by adding internal and external costs. Right? Environmental issues occur when social costs exceed private costs. You can kind of think about pollution, right? The cost of polluted air involves both private and social costs. So here's kind of a question for you. What if you had to pay the social cost of driving a car? What if there was some way that, maybe Ford or some government agency figures out a way to put a little meter in your car that measures your pollution, and at the end of the month someone comes to your car, reads the meter, kind of like a power bill, and says, this is how much you polluted, here's the amount you have to pay. What would you do? Would you drive less? What would your reaction be? Right? So this is kind of, a riff on an externality, right? It's a situation in which a private cost or benefit diverges from a social cost or benefit. It's a situation in which the costs or benefits of an action are not fully borne or gained by the two parties engaged in a scarce resource using activity. So here's kind of a graph that's dealing with this question, right, of dealing with an externality. We're thinking, okay, well, suppose we have some, this is S1, right, which is some marginal cost of some action, right, but we're not taking into account the externality, right? So perhaps we're thinking a little bit about driving a car, but we're not thinking about pollution. And then something happens at S2 where we can take into account the pollution. So that shifts how we decide to drive, right? So then we have our kind of supply curve shifting, and the amount of good X per time period goes down while the price rises. Right? An externality arises when there is a divergence between private cost and social cost. The remedy is to change the signal for decision making. In the case of industrial pollution, the firm must be forced to internalize the cost of environmental damage. All right, so here's the polluter's choice. They can install pollution abatement equipment or change production techniques, right? Things that can stem the rise of pollution. They can reduce pollution-causing activities, or they can pay the price to pollute, right? That's how we sort of can change the signals of their externalities, right? So how about a uniform tax? Well, it could be that we just levy a uniform tax, as external costs might vary from location to location, right? Polluting in some place may actually affect more than another place. But we must establish the amount of economic damages. It's an important thing. We have to come up with a measure of economic costs. So what if the federal government were to require all polluters pay the same tax, right, in spite of different costs, maybe by location? Well, in some markets, the supply curve would shift upward insufficiently to reduce the amount of pollution-generating activities to reflect all social costs, right? It may not do enough. And in other places, it may shift by more than the required amount, so you're actually losing out on some good production. And, of course, in some places, it might be just right. So, how much pollution is too much, right? Well, the answer you might think immediately, oh, zero. Well, that may not be true. Much like everything in economics, there is a marginal benefit and marginal cost, and we always want to look for the point of equality. It's the optimal amount, right? There may be some optimal quantity of pollution, the level of pollution for which the marginal benefit of one additional unit of pollution, if there is such a thing, one unit of pollution abatement, just equals the marginal cost of that additional unit. And here's sort of this graph. We have the marginal benefit of polluting kind of goes down, as you would think, and the marginal cost of polluting goes up. And so there may be some sort of intersection, right? And here's sort of this example, this policy example. So since 2000, China's accounted for about 2/3 of total increase in global emissions of carbon dioxide, and its total annual emissions of pollutants now exceed about 30% of the world's total. Air pollution ranks second to cigarette smoking as cause of death in China, and it affects tourism. And economists indicate that the marginal benefit of pollution abatement in China now exceeds its marginal cost. So this has been true, but China's policy has been reacting to this, and I think by some year in the future they're expected to be a world's leader in green energy sources, and that's kind of a response from such a black mark on their record, if you will, is that they've had these over and under terrible polluting problems, and now they're responding by going into an innovation of green energy, right? So how might we reduce the carbon footprint, right? Are there alternatives to polluting, right? Why aren't we all shifting to solar power panel and electric cars? Well, it might just be that the cost of generating solar power is much higher, so the incentive structure isn't quite right. You say, well, I could get solar, but it's much cheaper to do oil, right? In addition, the manufacturing of solar panels could itself cause pollution. This is true in a sense. There is pollution inherently in creating solar panels, but the reduction of pollution from using solar panels should more than make up for it. Additionally, we want to think a little bit about the role that private property plays into environmental economics. So private property, to remind you, is the exclusive rights of ownership that allows the use, transfer, and exchange of property, right? And common property is property that is owned by everyone and therefore by no one, right? You could think of like air and water. So what do you think? Why does pollution occur when property rights are poorly defined? Well, when no one owns a particular resource and no one then has an incentive to consider misusing it, right? So then there are voluntary agreements and transaction costs. Is it possible for externalities to be internalized via voluntary agreement? What costs are incurred by the parties who seek to negotiate an agreement? Well, you could think voluntary agreements, opportunity costs always exists, whoever has property rights, right? And transaction costs, all costs associated with making, reaching, and enforcing agreement. And they must be low relative to the expected benefits. So changing property rights, closing the gap between private costs and social costs. We could do this by taxation, subsidization, regulation, right? And you could think about a common example of common property problems is endangered species, right? Virtually all species that are not endangered are private property. You could think of dogs, cats, cattle, sheep, horses, right? But endangered species are typically common property. So how do we consolidate protecting endangered species when there inherently isn't this private incentive? Well, that is sort of a problem that we need to think about. In 1973, the federal government passed the Endangered Species Act in an attempt to keep species from dying out. And as more and more species were put on this list, the trade-off became apparent. How do we protect these species, and how do we fund it? How do we assure that this common property is protected for the good of all of us?